Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the sprint planning, which is one of the 5 events in Scrum. And as you remember, we have the sprints one after the other without anything between each 2 sprints. And inside the sprint, which is a container for the other 4 events, we start everything by sprint planning. Like every other event in a Scrum, sprint planning is designed to be a formal opportunity for inspecting and adapting the artifacts. That's the same for all of them. It's about inspection, adaptation, and do you still remember the third one? Transparency. We start by transparency, and in each of these things, we have different artifacts that help us increase transparency. And it's not only about artifacts, we have different elements that help increase transparency. We use the transparency to inspect, and we inspect in order to adapt. So, here, like everywhere else, we have transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The other thing is that when it comes to daily scrums, we really want them to be at the same time and place every day, every working day. Because otherwise, it doesn't make sense to plan for a 15-minute meeting. So that's obvious for daily scrums. But even for the rest of them, we still prefer to have them at the same time and place every time. So, for example, if you have monthly sprints, then maybe you can have a plan to have your sprint planning on the first day of each month in your special room, which is something else. In Agile, we prefer to have a room for everyone to work together. It's not like having people in different departments of the organization contributing to the project. We want them to be co-located. Okay, so like every other event, sprint planning is time-boxed. Do you remember the meaning of time-boxing? It means that it has a predefined duration, and we never, ever extend that duration. And because we know that we won't do that, then when we are doing the sprint planning things, we have to be careful. We have to be mindful about the things we do and focus. Focus is important. Later on, we will see that focus is one of the values in Scrum. We have to focus on the agenda for sprint planning and on the most important things in that agenda. In other words, the time that we normally have for sprint planning is really enough for sprint planning. If it's not enough, you have a different type of problem somewhere else, and you have to find it and fix it. And where do you usually find those problems and plan for improvements? That's usually the sprint retrospective. You're not limited to that, but that's a structured way of planning for your improvements. So, coming back to sprint planning, it is time-boxed, but how long? The maximum is 8 hours. And usually you have time boxes of 8 hours when your sprint is 1 month, which is the maximum duration for a sprint. And if your sprints are shorter, then it will be shorter than 8 hours. In the past, in the beginning, it used to be proportional. So the advice was that if you have a 2-week sprint, then you need to have a sprint planning of 4 hours. But it's not recommended like that in the Scrum Guide anymore. It just tells you that it's a maximum of 8 hours. And it's up to you to decide how long you want it to be. For example, you can still have a monthly sprint and decide to have 6 hours for your sprint planning. You time box it to be 6 hours. Or you may have 1 week long sprints and still decide for some strange reasons to have 8 hours for your sprint planning. That's fine according to Scrum Guide. Okay. This meeting is for the internal team. The developers, the Scrum Master, and the product owner, they get together and plan the sprint. But in addition to that, they may invite some other people to join them. to, for example, provide them with some expertise, some information, or some ideas about the way they can work during the sprint. That's okay. Something else that is general in Scrum and most agile systems is that when we say that this meeting for these people, it doesn't mean that it's confidential or private. Anyone else can come to the meeting, but as long as they just observe and don't talk. They're just there to see what's happening. For example, another team in your organization who's using a Scrum may want to come to your sprint planning and see how you're doing your sprint planning to get ideas and improve their own sprint planning. It's okay as long as they stand in a corner and don't talk, as long as they don't distract you. Okay? So, we get together, we prepare, and we have 3 different goals here. We need to answer these 3 fundamental questions. Why are we going to do this sprint? What are we going to do? And how are we going to do that? So, one at a time. Although the first 2 don't have an order. I'll tell you about that later. So, the why part. Why do we want to do this sprint? What's our objective? What's our goal? That's when we create a sprint goal, as we talked about before, because our goals are more than the sum of the items that we work on. The goal is something that directs us in understanding the items that we're going to work on. For example, you remember we talked about the sprint backlog and product backlog in the first lesson, and we're again talking about here. So the item is not extremely different. The scope of the item is different, the depth is different, but the most important difference is that I had a different goal for the first lesson. In the first lesson, I just wanted you to have an overall understanding of a Scrum, but now I want to tell you everything about the sprint planning. So even now, I won't go through all the details related to sprint backlog because we have another lesson about it. Here, we are focused on sprint planning. So that's how I interpret the item to talk about the sprint backlog in this lesson. You see, that's the same in your projects. So anyway, all of them together, the developers, the Scrum Master, and the product owner decide about the sprint goal. Okay? The second thing that we have to do is to think about what we are going to do. And the first question really helps us. Why are we going to do it? Okay, now we know why we're going to run this sprint. Now, what are we going to do exactly? It's going to be more concrete now. And the way we do it is that we pick a number of items from the product backlog and bring them to the sprint backlog. It's absolutely 100% up to the developers to decide how many items they want to pick because they know best how much capacity they have, how much work they can do. But the items that will be selected, which item will be selected, in which order we will go through the product backlog, that's up to the product owner. Ordering the product backlog is the accountability of the product owner. So we pick all of them, not all of them, as much as we believe we can do in one sprint as the developers. Now, something that we usually have here is that we need to think about the items in the product backlog. Are we ready to do that item? What does it mean for an item to be ready? For example, you may have an item there telling you the example we had before, the CRM, Customer Relationship Management feature for our application. It's huge. So if you see an item like that, you go, oh, okay, so it's just mentioning a CRM, but what do you mean by a CRM? What type of features do you want to have in CRM? If they give it to you, you can't even estimate, you can't size that item because it's not clear enough. It's as if it's not ready. So practically, when we talk about being ready for an item, it means that it's ready to be developed in the upcoming sprint, and you can finish it in one sprint. And in order to do that, it has to be small enough to fit inside one sprint, and it has to have the information you need in order to do it. For example, saying that we want to have a CRM, that's not enough. You need to say what type of features you want. So practically, an item like CRM is not ready. And typically, a good product owner never lets the product backlog have such an item on top of it, because the items on the top of the product backlog will be developed soon. When they see that there's an item like that on the top of the product backlog, they will refine it. They will break it down into smaller items. They may add more information and so on. We will talk about it later. It's called refinement, product backlog refinement. But there's something else here. What happens if you're in the middle of the sprint planning meeting and you reach an item in the product backlog and you see that it's not ready? Would you skip that? Would you cancel your sprint even though it's not even started? Would you extend your sprint? What would you do? And the proper answer is that if it's really on top of the product backlog and the product owner believes that it needs to be there because it's very important and very valuable for us, then we should pick it, even if it's not ready. And then when we start working, which is after sprint planning, then we will get together with the product owner and we will refine it. We will add more information. We may even break it down into smaller items. So the main message here is that just focus on the value and order of the items. Don't use readiness as a gate. Gate is one of those things that Scrum is very worried about. It's one of the taboos somehow. You remember the other taboos we talked about: methodology, process, and now we have gates. There's more. I'll try to remember all of them and repeat them for you. Okay, so the other thing that happens is that some people create something they call the definition of ready. You already know that we have a definition of done, which is absolutely necessary. By the way, everything we talk about in this course are the things that are mandatory to have in a Scrum, unless I tell you otherwise. But there's no mention of definition of ready in a Scrum. But it doesn't mean that it's forbidden. There are lots of things that are not mentioned in a Scrum. And as I told you before, Scrum is a framework, and then you will add different techniques and practices and extra things to it. Now, someone may decide to add one extra thing called definition of ready. Now, is it okay? Because you know that even though we say that you will add extra things, some of the things are not acceptable. You remember in the previous lesson, for example, we talked about the fact that we should not have specialist sprints like integration sprint or sprint zero. It's forbidden to have. Now, what about definition of ready? You can have a definition of ready if you really want, as long as you don't turn it into a gate here. So if you create a definition of ready and use it as a gate to decide which items to pick and which items not to pick, then that is wrong and you should not have such a definition of ready. But if you define it and only use it to make sure that everything is refined before the sprint planning meeting, then it's okay. All right. So you continue and pick the items that you want, and that would be your answer to the what question. Now, well, when you're doing that, you remember the 3 pillars of a Scrum: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And yes, I never mentioned the word pillar before. Those 3 are called the pillars. We will have a different lesson for that. Don't worry. Transparency is important, and one of the things that help us with transparency is the definition of done, as we talked about before, because when you have a documented definition of done, then anyone who sees something that you've marked as done knows exactly what you mean. For example, does it also contain user documentation? Is it part of your definition of done? That's transparency. The other thing that it can do, which is very helpful, is that it helps you understand how many items you can pick. For example, if you're supposed to have a very comprehensive user documentation in your definition of done, then you have to spend some time doing that. And therefore, you will have fewer items here. You need to have fewer items here. But if you don't have that type of trouble in your project, then you'll be free to pick more items. You'll have more time in your sprint. So practically what happens is that the definition of done is one of the things that help you as the developers to understand how many items you can pick for the sprint. Okay. So now we have the answer to the what question, and our answer is the product backlog items that we picked for our sprint. Now, the thing that I mentioned in the beginning is that there is no exact order between the first two, the why and the what question. Well, more or less, we start with the why question and then go to the what question. But it's a little bit iterative. So what it means is that you think about the sprint goal. It's still not finalized because you're in the sprint planning. You feel that you're happy about it as the whole team, and then start thinking about the items. You pick the most important items, and when you do that, you see that, well, the items that I've picked are not 100% aligned with the sprint goal. Now, in response to that, you may want to change the items, or you may want to make some changes in your sprint backlog based on that. So the first two have a few rounds of negotiation. They do it, and then at the end, you will have your sprint goal and your product backlog items. And then we have the third topic. These three are topics in sprint planning. The third topic is about how you're going to do those things. The first topic about why is done by all those three people, the Scrum Master, developers, and product owner. The second one is mainly done by the developers and product owner. And this last one is only done by the developers because it's a technical decision. It's a decision about the way you're going to do the work. And only the people who are actually going to do the work are allowed to make that decision. It's 100% up to the developers. So they think about the items, and in order to understand how they're going to do that, they will decompose those items into small work items. Or the Scrum Guide calls them work items. We typically call them tasks, but, well, tasks somehow has a negative connotation in some agile communities. But anyway, small technical things. For example, your item may be about resetting passwords in a website. You want to add an extra feature to let users reset their passwords. Now you start thinking about it and you create those small work items, technical things. One of them is, for example, the user interface, one way of authentication, understanding that this is the same user. For example, using the email address or phone number or a security question like 200 years ago, something like that, to make sure that the person is who they claim to be. Another feature to receive the new password and, for example, check to see if this is strong enough. Then you need another feature, another task. Another task to update your database. Another task to communicate the change to the user, and so on. All right? So we go on like this, but you remember that this is agile, this is adaptive. We don't do upfront planning. If you stay here in your sprint planning and think about each and every item and plan all of them, this is a type of planning. Then it would be an upfront planning for your sprint. And that's not really okay because it blocks your adaptation a little bit. It's not lean. It's not just in time. So instead of that, what you would do is focus on a on the first few items, the things you need to do in the first few days. And for the rest of them, you will continue planning during the sprint. As simple as that. Okay, and that was our third topic, where we create those small work items, the tasks. But don't tell anyone that they are tasks. Okay, we're done with the sprint planning. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about daily Scrum.